Winter had descended upon the village of Ashford like a punishment from heaven itself. Snow blanketed the thatched rooftops and clung to the bare branches of the ancient oaks that lined the road leading toward the distant castle, a fortress of gray stone that rose against the pale sky like a crown upon the land. The year was 1402, and England shivered beneath the weight of a season that seemed determined to test the endurance of every soul who dared to breathe. In a small cottage at the edge of the village, where the forest began its slow encroachment upon civilization, a young woman sat beside a dying fire. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore, and her fingers, red and raw from the cold, moved with practiced precision over a length of crimson velvet, each stitch a small act of defiance against the poverty that surrounded her. She was 23 years of age, with hair the color of autumn chestnuts and eyes that held the quiet gray of a winter morning. There was nothing remarkable about her, the villagers would say, nothing that would distinguish her from any other seamstress in any other forgotten corner of the kingdom. And yet, those same villagers whispered about her with a mixture of pity and contempt that Eleanor had learned to ignore years ago. She was the daughter of a disgraced merchant, a man who had once traded silks and spices with the great houses of London, who had dressed his wife in pearls and his daughter in ribbons, who had promised Eleanor a future as bright as the fabrics he sold. But promises, Eleanor had learned, were as fragile as the threads she now wove into garments for others. Her father had been accused of theft by a nobleman whose name still burned in Eleanor's memory like a brand upon flesh. Lord Aldrich Pemberton had claimed that William Whitmore had stolen from the royal treasury itself, had forged documents, had betrayed the trust of the crown. The accusations had been lies. Eleanor knew this with the certainty of her own heartbeat. But lies spoken by powerful men became truths in the courts of England. Her father had died in prison before his trial could conclude. Her mother had followed him into the grave within the year, her heart simply refusing to continue beating in a world so cruel. And Eleanor had been left alone at the age of 16, with nothing but her mother's sewing needles and the skills her grandmother had taught her in a sunlit room that now existed only in memory. The fire crackled weakly, and Eleanor paused in her work to feed it another precious log. Wood was expensive, and the coins she earned from her sewing barely covered the cost of bread and thread. But the velvet beneath her hands belonged to Lady Pemberton herself, the wife of the very man who had destroyed Eleanor's family, and the irony of this was not lost on the young seamstress. Lady Pemberton wanted a gown for the winter festival at the castle, a celebration that would bring nobles from across the kingdom to pay homage to King Henry himself. Eleanor would never be invited, of course. Women of her station did not attend such events. They merely created the beauty that others would wear. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Eleanor set aside her work and rose, her worn woolen dress brushing against the cold floor as she crossed the small room. She expected to find perhaps a messenger from Lady Pemberton, demanding to know when the gown would be finished. Or perhaps one of the village children, seeking warmth and a kind word from the only woman in Ashford who never turned them away. What she found instead made her breath catch in her throat. A man stood in her doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a cloak of deepest blue that bore no insignia she could recognize. His face was shadowed by a hood, but she could see the strong line of his jaw, the curve of lips that seemed poised between amusement and something darker. Snow dusted his shoulders and clung to his boots, and there was something in the way he held himself that spoke of authority, of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Mistress Whitmore?" His voice was low, carefully controlled, like a blade kept sheathed but ready. Eleanor's hand tightened on the door. "Who asks?" A traveler seeking shelter from the storm. He glanced past her into the modest cottage, and Eleanor felt suddenly aware of how poor her surroundings must appear. The threadbare furniture, the meager fire, the single candle burning on the table beside her work. "I was told in the village that you sometimes offer hospitality to those in need." This was true. Eleanor had never been able to turn away a stranger, despite the dangers such kindness might invite. Her mother had been the same, a woman whose heart had been too large for the world that had crushed it. "The inn is just down the road," Eleanor said carefully. "They have rooms and fires and ale." "The inn is full." The man's lips curved into something that was almost a smile. "And I confess, I have heard things about your skill with a needle that made me curious to meet you." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "My skill with a needle is no concern of travelers." "Perhaps not." He tilted his head, and for a moment the firelight caught his eyes, a deep, startling blue, like the heart of a winter sky. "But it is of great concern to those who value beauty and craftsmanship. May I come in, Mistress Whitmore? I give you my word that I mean you no harm." There was something in his voice, a sincerity that cut through Eleanor's suspicion like a warm current through cold water. Against her better judgment, she stepped aside. The man entered her cottage, and as he lowered his hood, Eleanor felt the world tilt slightly beneath her feet. She did not recognize him. She was certain she had never seen his face before. And yet there was something about him that seemed to demand recognition, as though he carried an invisible weight that others could sense even without understanding its source. He was handsome, she realized with a jolt of something she refused to name. Not in the soft, pampered way of the nobles she occasionally glimpsed from a distance, but in a way that spoke of hardship overcome, of battles fought and won. His dark hair was swept back from a face that bore the faintest trace of a scar along his left cheekbone, and his eyes held a depth that made Eleanor want to look away and keep looking in equal measure. "You have been working on Lady Pemberton's gown," he observed, his gaze falling upon the crimson velvet still spread across her table. Eleanor moved to stand between him and her work, a protective gesture she could not quite explain. "How do you know what I work on?" "Because Lady Pemberton speaks of nothing else." There was a dryness to his tone that suggested familiarity with the lady in question. "She wishes to be the most beautiful woman at the winter festival. She believes your needle will achieve what nature could not." The words were spoken without cruelty, but Eleanor flinched nonetheless. She knew what the nobility thought of her, the disgraced seamstress who served those who had destroyed her family because she had no other choice. The shame of it burned in her chest, even after all these years. "I do my work," she said quietly. "Nothing more." The man studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor had the unsettling sensation that he was seeing far more than she wished to reveal. "You do your work," he repeated, "and you do it brilliantly from what I hear. The Countess of Northwood spoke of a gown you made for her daughter, said it was the finest she had ever seen. Lord Ashworth claims the cloak you repaired for him saved his life during a hunting accident, so strong was the stitching." Eleanor said nothing. She had not realized that her work had earned such notice beyond the immediate circle of those who commissioned it. "And yet," the man continued, his voice softening, "you remain here in this cottage barely able to afford wood for your fire, while those who wear your creations dance in warm halls and drink wine from silver cups. That is the way of the world." Eleanor's voice was steady, though something trembled beneath it. "Some are born to dance, and some are born to sew the gowns they dance in." "Is it?" The man took a step closer, and Eleanor found herself unable to retreat. "Or is that simply what those in power wish you to believe?" Before she could respond, a gust of wind rattled the cottage door, and the fire guttered low. The man glanced toward the hearth, then back at Eleanor, and something shifted in his expression, a decision being made behind those unreadable eyes. "I should go," he said. "The storm will worsen before it passes, and I have imposed upon your hospitality long enough." "You have barely warmed yourself." The words escaped before Eleanor could stop them. "At least stay until the wind dies down." The man smiled then, a true smile, one that transformed his stern features into something almost gentle. "You are kind, Mistress Whitmore, kinder than this world deserves." He reached into his cloak and withdrew a small leather pouch which he placed upon her table beside the crimson velvet. The pouch clinked with the unmistakable sound of coins. "For your hospitality," he said, "and for the conversation." Eleanor shook her head. "I cannot accept—" "You can, and you will." His tone brooked no argument. "Consider it payment for a future commission. I may have need of your skills before the winter festival ends." And then, before Eleanor could protest further, He was gone, a shadow slipping back into the storm, leaving behind only footprints in the snow and the weight of gold that Eleanor did not dare count. She stood in the doorway long after he had vanished, the cold biting at her cheeks, her heart beating with a rhythm she did not recognize. She did not know his name. She did not know why he had come or what he truly wanted. But something had shifted in the air of her small cottage, something that felt like the first crack of ice upon a frozen river. Change was coming. Eleanor could feel it in her bones, in the trembling of her fingers, in the strange warmth that lingered where his presence had been. She closed the door against the wind and returned to her work, but her stitches were uneven now, her thoughts scattered like snowflakes in a gale. Who was he? And why did she feel, with a certainty she could not explain, that her life would never be the same? Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Stories like this one, tales of courage, resilience, and unexpected destiny, are shared here every week, and you will not want to miss what happens next. Subscribe now and join us on this journey. Miles from the small cottage where Eleanor Whitmore sat surrounded by velvet and uncertainty, the man who had left gold upon her table rode through the storm with his head bowed against the wind. His name was not known to her, but it was known to every soul in England who had ever bent a knee or sworn an oath. He was Edward Blackwood, Duke of Ashworth, cousin to the king himself, and one of the most powerful men in the realm. But power, Edward had learned, was as much a prison as a privilege. He had spent 32 years learning to wear the mask that nobility demanded, the mask of authority, of certainty, of a man who knew his place in the world and never questioned it. And yet, beneath that mask, something had begun to crack. The visit to the seamstress's cottage had been an impulse, a deviation from the carefully ordered path his life had always followed. He had heard her name spoken at court, Eleanor Whitmore, the disgraced merchant's daughter, the woman who created beauty with her hands while living in squalor. He had expected to find bitterness, perhaps, or the hollow resignation of someone long broken by circumstance. Instead, he had found fire. Not the raging, destructive fire of anger, but something quieter and more dangerous, the steady flame of a spirit that refused to be extinguished. She had looked at him without fear, without the fawning deference he received from every other person in his life. She had questioned him, challenged him, treated him as a man rather than a title. He had not realized how desperately he craved such treatment until that moment. The castle appeared through the veil of snow, its towers rising like fingers pointing toward heaven. Edward guided his horse through the gates, nodding to the guards who bowed as he passed, and dismounted in the courtyard with the practiced ease of a man who had spent half his life on horseback. A stable boy rushed forward to take the reins, and Edward strode into the great hall, snow melting from his cloak as the warmth of roaring fires engulfed him. "Your Grace." A servant appeared at his elbow, her eyes downcast. "His Majesty has been asking for you." Edward suppressed a sigh. "Where is he?" "In his private chambers, my lord. He said it was urgent." Of course it was urgent. Everything was urgent to King Henry, a man who saw threats in every shadow and conspiracies in every whisper. Edward had loved his cousin once, when they were boys together, before the weight of the crown had twisted Henry into something Edward barely recognized. Now their relationship was a careful dance of loyalty and suspicion, each step measured to avoid catastrophe. He found Henry pacing before the fire in his chambers, his thin frame wrapped in furs despite the warmth, his pale eyes darting toward the door as Edward entered. "Cousin!" Henry's voice was sharp, brittle. "Where have you been?" "Riding." Edward removed his cloak and handed it to a waiting attendant. "The storm caught me on the road." "You should not ride alone. You know this." Henry's fingers twitched at his sides, a nervous habit he had developed in recent years. "There are those who would see you dead, Edward. Those who would use your death to weaken my throne. I can defend myself, Your Majesty." "Can you?" Henry's laugh was hollow. "Against an arrow from the shadows? Against poison in your wine? Against the daggers of those who smile to your face while plotting your destruction?" Edward said nothing. He had learned long ago that there was no reasoning with Henry when the shadows of paranoia closed in. All he could do was wait for the storm to pass. Henry seemed to collect himself, his breathing slowing as he sank into a chair beside the fire. "Forgive me, cousin. I am unsettled. The winter festival approaches, and with it come nobles from every corner of the realm. Any one of them could be a traitor." "The festival has been a tradition for generations," Edward said carefully. "It is a time for celebration, not conspiracy." "Everything is conspiracy." Henry's voice was barely a whisper. "Do you think I do not see the way they look at me? The lords who bow and scrape while counting the days until my death? The ladies who smile while their husbands plot to place another on my throne?" Edward crossed the room and knelt before his cousin, meeting his fevered gaze with steady calm. "Henry, you are the king. God himself placed the crown upon your head. No plot, no conspiracy, no whisper in the dark can change that. You must trust in your strength and in the loyalty of those who love you." For a moment, something flickered in Henry's eyes, a memory, perhaps, of the boy he had been before power had consumed him. "Do you love me, Edward? Truly? You are my cousin and my king. I would die for you." Henry stared at him for a long moment, then reached out and gripped Edward's shoulder with surprising strength. "Then I need you to do something for me, something only you can do." "Name it." "There is a woman," Henry said slowly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "A seamstress in the village of Ashford. Her name is Eleanor Whitmore. I have heard things about her, things that disturb me." Edward's blood ran cold, but his expression remained unchanged. "What things, Your Majesty?" "She is the daughter of a traitor, a man who stole from the crown itself." "And yet she remains in my kingdom, sewing gowns for my nobles, living as though her father's crimes mean nothing." Henry's grip tightened. "I want her brought to the castle, Edward. I want to look into her eyes and see for myself whether the corruption of her blood runs in her veins." "She is a seamstress," Edward said, choosing his words with extreme care. "What threat could she possibly pose?" "That is what I intend to discover." Henry released him and leaned back in his chair, his eyes glittering in the firelight. "Bring her to me before the festival begins. As my guest, of course. I am not a monster, cousin, but I will know the truth of her loyalties. And if I find her wanting—" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Edward rose to his feet, his heart pounding behind the wall of his composure. "As you command, Your Majesty." He bowed and withdrew from the chamber, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just been ordered to do. The woman he had met only hours ago, the woman whose quiet strength had stirred something long dormant in his chest, was now in mortal danger, and he was the one who had been sent to deliver her into that danger. Edward stood in the corridor, the cold stone pressing against his back, and faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could obey his king, bring Eleanor Whitmore to the castle, and watch as Henry's paranoia consumed her. Or he could defy the crown, warn her, help her flee to safety, and accept the consequences of treason. For the first time in 32 years, the Duke of Ashworth did not know what path to take. But he knew, with a certainty that frightened him, that he could not watch Eleanor Whitmore be destroyed, not while he still drew breath. 3 days passed before Eleanor saw the stranger again. She had almost convinced herself that their meeting had been a dream, a moment of madness brought on by the cold and the loneliness that had become her constant companions. The gold he had left sat untouched in its pouch, hidden beneath a loose floorboard where no thief would think to look. She could not bring herself to spend it. Something about the coins felt like a promise, and Eleanor had learned to be wary of promises. Lady Pemberton's gown was nearly finished. Eleanor had worked through the nights, her fingers flying over the velvet with a speed born of desperation. The sooner the gown was completed, the sooner she would be free of any connection to the woman who had stood beside her husband as he accused William Whitmore of crimes he had not committed. Eleanor did not hate Lady Pemberton. Hatred required energy she could not spare, but she resented the necessity of serving her, of creating beauty for a woman who had helped steal everything Eleanor had ever loved. On the morning of the third day, a knock came at her door. Eleanor set aside her needle and rose, expecting the messenger from Lady Pemberton, who had been sent twice already to demand updates on the gown's progress. Instead, she found a small boy standing in the snow, his cheeks red with cold, clutching a sealed letter in both hands. "For you, mistress," he said, thrusting the letter toward her. "The man said it was important." "What man?" But the boy was already running, his bare feet leaving prints in the snow as he disappeared down the road toward the village. Eleanor carried the letter inside and examined the seal, a crest she did not recognize, pressed into black wax. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke it open and unfolded the parchment within. The handwriting was elegant, each letter formed with the precision of someone educated in the finest traditions of nobility. "Mistress Whitmore, I write to you with a request that may seem presumptuous, given the brevity of our acquaintance. I ask only that you read these words with an open heart and consider what I propose. You have been noticed by those in power, not for any fault of your own, but for the circumstances of your birth and the lingering shadow of accusations that were never proven true. There are those who would use your father's disgrace against you, who would see you suffer for crimes you did not commit. I cannot explain more in writing, but I urge you to accept an invitation that will arrive shortly. An invitation to attend the winter festival at the castle as a guest of honor. I know this must seem impossible, even absurd, but I give you my word that this is your only path to safety and perhaps to justice. Trust me, Eleanor. I am not your enemy. The letter will come tomorrow. Say yes." There was no signature, no name, no indication of who had sent it. But Eleanor knew. She knew with a certainty that defied reason. The stranger who had warmed himself by her fire had sent this warning. The man whose eyes had seen through her defenses as though they were made of glass. She read the letter 3 times, her heart beating faster with each pass. Attend the winter festival as a guest of honor. The idea was laughable, a seamstress walking among dukes and ladies, dining at the same tables as the nobles who had destroyed her family. And yet, the letter spoke of danger, of those who would use her father's disgrace against her. What danger? From whom? And how had this stranger, whoever he was, become aware of it? Eleanor did not sleep that night. She sat beside her fire, the letter clutched in her hands, and watched the flames dance as her mind churned through possibilities too numerous to count. By dawn, she had reached no conclusions and found no peace. But when the second knock came, a messenger in royal livery, bearing an invitation stamped with the king's own seal, Eleanor Whitmore did something that surprised even herself. She said yes. The messenger had barely departed when Eleanor began to understand the magnitude of what she had agreed to. She had no gown suitable for a royal festival, no jewels to adorn her plain features, no training in the intricate dances and courtly manners that would be expected of a guest in the king's hall. She was a seamstress, for God's sake, a woman who made beautiful things for others to wear while she herself dressed in woolen patches. But as she stood in the center of her cottage, the royal invitation still warm in her hands, a strange calm descended over her. She might not have the fine gowns of noble ladies, but she had something far more valuable. She had her skill. Eleanor Whitmore knew how to create beauty from nothing. She had done it 1,000 times for others. Now, for the first time in her life, she would do it for herself. She pulled out every scrap of fabric she had accumulated over the years, pieces of silk left over from commissions, remnants of velvet deemed too small to be useful, lengths of lace that had been rejected by picky clients. Separately, they were worthless. Together, they were the raw materials of transformation. For 4 days and 4 nights, Eleanor worked without rest. She cut and pinned and stitched, her fingers moving with a speed and precision that bordered on supernatural. The gown that took shape beneath her hands was unlike anything she had ever created, a masterpiece of deep midnight blue, scattered with fragments of silver that caught the light like stars across a winter sky. The bodice was fitted, elegant, designed to complement her slender frame rather than compete with the bolder figures of noble ladies. The skirt flowed like water, layers of silk whispering against each other with every movement. It was not a gown meant to impress through wealth or status. It was a gown that spoke of artistry, of a beauty that could not be bought with gold. On the evening of the 5th day, Eleanor stood before the small, cracked mirror in her cottage and barely recognized the woman who stared back at her. The gown had transformed her from a forgotten seamstress into something else entirely, something that defied the boundaries of the world she had always known. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like to walk into the king's hall, to hold her head high among those who had looked down upon her for so long. She imagined the faces of Lady Pemberton and her husband, their shock at seeing the daughter of the man they had destroyed appearing not as a servant, but as a guest. But beneath the fantasy, fear coiled in her stomach like a serpent waiting to strike. What was she walking into? What danger awaited her in the halls of power? And why, despite every rational instinct screaming at her to flee, did some deeper part of her soul insist that this was the path she was meant to take? If you are watching this and feel moved by Eleanor's courage, by her determination to face the unknown despite her fears, leave a comment now saying, "Every ending is the start of something new." Let this phrase be a reminder that sometimes the darkest moments lead to the brightest dawns. The carriage sent to collect Eleanor arrived at dawn on the day of the winter festival. It was a modest vehicle by noble standards, but to Eleanor's eyes, it might as well have been a chariot of gold. The horses were sleek and well-fed, their breath misting in the cold air, and the driver who helped her inside wore livery that cost more than she earned in a year. She clutched her mother's old shawl around her shoulders, the only thing she had kept from her former life, and watched through the window as her cottage grew smaller and smaller, eventually disappearing behind a curtain of snow. She did not know if she would ever see it again. She did not know if she wanted to. The journey to the castle took the better part of the morning. Eleanor watched the landscape change from the humble farms of Ashford to the rolling estates of minor nobility, and finally to the vast manicured grounds that surrounded the royal fortress. The castle itself was even more imposing up close than it had seemed from a distance, a mountain of stone and power that had stood for centuries, a monument to the might of English kings. The carriage passed through 3 sets of gates before finally coming to a halt in a courtyard filled with nobles, servants, and more finery than Eleanor had seen in her entire life. Ladies in gowns of silk and velvet stepped from gilded carriages, their jewels glittering in the pale winter sunlight. Lords in doublets of embroidered cloth strode across the cobblestones, their voices raised in greeting and laughter, and Eleanor sat frozen in her seat, suddenly aware of how foolish she had been to come. What was she doing here? These were not her people. This was not her world. She was a seamstress, the daughter of a disgraced merchant, a woman who had spent her life in the shadows cast by those who now surrounded her. She did not belong here. But before she could command the driver to turn around, the carriage door opened and a gloved hand extended toward her. Mistress Whitmore. She knew that voice. She had heard it by her fire, speaking of beauty and injustice while snow fell outside her window. Eleanor looked up into the face of the stranger who had set all of this in motion, and for a moment, she forgot how to breathe. He was dressed in the formal attire of a high noble, a doublet of deep blue velvet embroidered with gold, a cloak lined with fur, boots of polished leather. A chain of office hung around his neck, marking him as someone of immense importance. "Who are you?" she whispered. "My name is Edward Blackwood," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Duke of Ashworth, cousin to the king." His eyes held hers with an intensity that seemed to burn. "And the man who is going to keep you safe tonight, Eleanor, if you trust me." The world tilted. The stranger, Edward, was a duke, a cousin to the king himself, one of the most powerful men in England, and he had visited her cottage, left gold upon her table, warned her of danger, and invited her into the lion's den. "Why?" she breathed. "Why me?" "Because you deserve justice." His grip on her hand tightened. "And because I have spent my entire life watching innocent people be destroyed by those in power. I am tired of standing aside. I am tired of being complicit." He helped her down from the carriage, and Eleanor stood on the cobblestones of the royal courtyard, her midnight gown flowing around her like a river of stars. She was aware of eyes turning toward her, nobles and servants alike, their expressions ranging from curiosity to confusion to open disdain. "They will wonder who I am," she said quietly. "Let them wonder." Edward offered her his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. "Tonight, you are not a seamstress from Ashford. You are my guest. And anyone who treats you with disrespect will answer to me." They walked together toward the great doors of the castle, and with every step, Eleanor felt the weight of her old life falling away. She was terrified. She was exhilarated. She was walking into the most dangerous place in England on the arm of a man she barely knew, trusting her fate to his words and his honor. But beneath the fear, something else was blooming, something that felt like hope. For the first time in 7 years, Eleanor Whitmore allowed herself to believe that her story was not yet finished. The great hall of the castle was a cathedral of candlelight and splendor. Chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, their flames reflected in 1,000 glittering crystals that cast rainbows across the stone walls. Tapestries depicting scenes of royal triumph adorned every surface, and musicians played from a gallery above, their melodies drifting down like snow from heaven. Eleanor had thought herself prepared for grandeur. She had been wrong. She walked beside Edward through the crowded hall, acutely aware of every whisper that followed in her wake. The nobles parted before them like waves before a ship's prow, their faces masks of polite curiosity that barely concealed the calculation beneath. She caught fragments of conversation as they passed. Who is she? Never seen her before. The Duke's new mistress, perhaps, and forced herself to keep her chin high, her expression serene. She was not a mistress. She was not a plaything. She was Eleanor Whitmore, and she had every right to stand in this hall. Even if her heart was pounding so hard, she feared it might burst from her chest. "You are doing well," Edward murmured, his voice barely audible above the music. "Just breathe. I will not leave your side." "They are staring at me. They are staring at your gown." The corner of his mouth curved upward. "You have created something magnificent, Eleanor. Let them stare. Let them wonder. Let them see what true beauty looks like." Before she could respond, a voice cut through the murmur of the crowd, a voice that made Edward's jaw tighten and Eleanor's blood run cold. "Cousin, there you are!" The crowd parted, and Eleanor found herself face to face with the King of England. Henry was not what she had expected. She had imagined a towering figure, a man whose presence filled every room he entered. Instead, she saw a slight man of perhaps 30 years, with pale skin stretched too thin over prominent bones and eyes that darted constantly, never settling on any one thing for more than a moment. He wore a crown of gold upon his head and robes of purple velvet trimmed with ermine, but the finery only emphasized his fragility rather than concealing it. "Your Majesty." Edward bowed, and Eleanor followed suit, sinking into the deepest curtsy she could manage. "May I present Mistress Eleanor Whitmore, who has honored us with her presence tonight." Henry's eyes fixed upon her, and Eleanor felt as though she were being examined by a falcon considering whether she was prey. There was a sharpness in his gaze that contradicted his frail appearance, an intelligence that missed nothing and forgave less. "Whitmore," he repeated slowly. "The name is familiar to me. Was your father not the merchant who stole from my treasury?" The words struck like a blow, but Eleanor refused to flinch. "My father was accused of such a crime, Your Majesty. He was never convicted. He died before his trial could conclude. Died in my prison." Henry's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. A guilty conscience, perhaps. Such things have been known to kill men. Eleanor felt Edward tense beside her, but before he could speak, she lifted her chin and met the king's gaze directly. "Or an innocent heart broken by injustice, Your Majesty. Such things have also been known to kill." A murmur rippled through the crowd. No one spoke to the king so boldly. No one dared. But something flickered in Henry's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or a spark of grudging respect. He studied Eleanor for a long moment, His head tilted slightly to one side, and then he laughed. It was not a warm sound, but neither was it entirely cruel. You have spirit, Mistress Whitmore. That is more than I can say for most of the simpering creatures who populate my court. He waved a hand dismissively. You may stay. Dance, eat, enjoy the festivities. But do not imagine that your father's shadow does not follow you still. He turned and drifted away into the crowd, his courtiers trailing behind him like the tail of a comet. Eleanor released a breath she had not realized she was holding. That was either very brave or very foolish, Edward said quietly. Perhaps both. Eleanor's voice was steadier than she felt. He wanted me to cower. I will not give him the satisfaction. Edward looked at her with an expression she could not quite decipher. No, he said softly. I do not imagine you will. The evening unfolded in a blur of music and motion. Eleanor danced with lords she had never met, their names and titles sliding from her memory almost as quickly as they were spoken. She ate delicacies she had only heard of in stories, roasted swan and honeyed figs, wines from France and spices from lands beyond the sea. She smiled and curtsied and made polite conversation, all while remaining acutely aware of Edward's presence nearby, a steadying force in the chaos of the unfamiliar. But beneath the surface of the festivities, something darker moved. She caught glimpses of Lord Pemberton across the hall, his face a mask of barely concealed fury. Lady Pemberton stood beside him, resplendent in the crimson gown that Eleanor herself had created, her expression sharp with jealousy as she watched the seamstress who had been meant to remain invisible now dancing at the heart of the celebration. And Henry watched as well. From his throne at the head of the hall, the king's eyes followed Eleanor through the crowd, his lips curved in that strange, unsettling smile. She was a mouse among cats, Eleanor realized, and the cats were growing hungry. The hour grew late, and the festivities began to wind toward their conclusion. Many of the older nobles had already retired to their chambers, leaving the hall to the younger guests who showed no signs of exhaustion. But Eleanor felt weariness pressing upon her like a physical weight, the strain of performing confidence she did not feel taking its toll. She had slipped away from the main hall and found a quiet alcove overlooking the castle gardens. Snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in white, and for a moment she allowed herself to simply breathe. You should not be alone. She turned to find Edward emerging from the shadows, his expression troubled. The king has retired for the evening, but his eyes are everywhere. It is not safe for you to wander unaccompanied. I needed air. Eleanor turned back to the window. I am not accustomed to such intensity. No. Edward came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. I imagine you are not. You have handled yourself remarkably well, Eleanor. Most people would have crumbled under the king's scrutiny. Most people have more to lose than I do. She kept her voice light, but the truth beneath it was heavy as stone. What is left to take from me? My father is dead. My mother is dead. My reputation was destroyed before I was old enough to understand what reputation meant. The king may threaten me all he wishes. I have already survived worse than his displeasure. Edward was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with an emotion she could not name. You are stronger than you know, Eleanor Whitmore. Stronger than anyone I have ever met. She turned to look at him and found his eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that made her heart stutter. Why did you bring me here? She asked quietly. Truly, you speak of justice, of protecting the innocent, but you are a duke, cousin to the king himself. What do you have to gain by championing a disgraced seamstress? Nothing. The word was simple, honest, stripped of all pretense. I have nothing to gain and everything to lose. If the king discovers that I warned you, that I arranged this invitation as a means of protection rather than entrapment, he will have my head. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Entrapment? Edward's jaw tightened. The king did not invite you because he admires your skill with a needle. He invited you because he suspects you of harboring treasonous thoughts, of plotting revenge against the crown for what was done to your father. He wanted you here so he could watch you, test you, find evidence of guilt that would justify your destruction. The words struck like blows, each one landing with brutal precision. But I would never. I know. Edward's hand found hers, his fingers warm against her cold skin. I know, Eleanor. I saw it the moment I met you. You are no traitor. You are simply a woman who has been wronged, who has survived with grace and dignity where others would have succumbed to bitterness. Then why? She could not finish the question. The implications were too vast, too terrifying. Because the king sees enemies everywhere. Because Lord Pemberton has been whispering in his ear, reminding him of your father's alleged crimes, suggesting that the daughter of a traitor must surely carry the same corruption in her blood. Edward's voice hardened with barely suppressed anger. Pemberton knows that your father was innocent. He knows because he was the one who forged the evidence, who orchestrated the entire conspiracy to destroy your family and claim your father's trading contracts for himself. Eleanor felt the world lurch beneath her feet. The suspicions she had nursed for 7 years, the questions she had never dared ask aloud, all of it confirmed in a single devastating moment. "How do you know this?" she whispered. "Because I have spent the last 2 years investigating what really happened." Edward's grip on her hand tightened. "When I first heard your father's case mentioned at court, something did not sit right. The evidence was too convenient, the witnesses too eager, the timing too perfect. I began to dig, quietly, carefully, and what I found was a web of lies that stretched from Lord Pemberton's household all the way to the treasury itself. You have proof? I have pieces, fragments, enough to raise suspicion but not yet enough to convince the king." Edward's expression was grim. Henry trusts Pemberton. They were childhood companions. To accuse the Lord of treason would require evidence so overwhelming that even the king's loyalty could not protect him. Eleanor's mind raced, pieces falling into place like the fragments of a shattered mirror reforming. "That is why you brought me here. Not just to protect me, but because you need me. You need me to help you expose Pemberton." Edward's silence was answer enough. "What would you have me do?" Eleanor asked, and was surprised to find that her voice was steady. "Nothing dangerous. Nothing that would put you at greater risk than you already face." Edward released her hand and stepped back, as though suddenly aware of how close they had been standing. "I simply need you to watch. Listen. You have access to places and people that I do not. The servants' quarters, the seamstresses' circles, the world below the notice of nobility. Pemberton's household is not as loyal as he believes. There are those who know the truth and might be willing to speak it, if approached by the right person. And you believe I am the right person? I believe you have more reason than anyone to want justice." Edward's eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw something that looked remarkably like faith. "I believe you are brave enough to seek it, and clever enough to find it. And I believe—" He paused, as though the words were difficult to speak. "I believe you are the only person I have ever met who makes me want to be better than I am." The confession hung in the air between them, fragile as frost. Eleanor did not know what to say. She did not know what she felt. Fear, yes, and anger at the injustice that had defined her life. But beneath it all, something warmer was stirring. Something that had nothing to do with justice or revenge, and everything to do with the man standing before her, his heart laid bare for her to accept or reject. "I will help you," she said finally. "Not for myself, and not for my father, but because you are right. There has been too much silence, too much suffering, too much injustice allowed to stand unchallenged." She lifted her chin and met his gaze directly. "I will help you bring Pemberton down." Edward's expression softened, with something that might have been relief or gratitude or something deeper still. "Thank you, Eleanor." She nodded once, sharply, and turned back toward the window. The snow continued to fall, covering the world in white, burying the darkness beneath a blanket of cold purity. Somewhere in the castle, Lord Pemberton slept soundly, confident in his power and his position. He had no idea that his destruction had already begun. The weeks that followed the winter festival were a blur of careful maneuvering and hidden conversations. Eleanor returned to her cottage in Ashford, but everything had changed. Where once she had been invisible, she was now watched, by the king's spies, by Pemberton's agents, by the curious eyes of villagers who had heard rumors of her appearance at the royal celebration. She ignored them all. Instead, she focused on the task Edward had given her. She visited the great houses where she had once delivered her work, speaking with servants and seamstresses who had known her mother, who remembered the days before the Whitmore family's disgrace. She listened to whispered stories of Lord Pemberton's cruelty, his debts, his desperate need for gold that had driven him to destroy an innocent man for access to profitable trade routes. Slowly, piece by piece, the truth began to emerge. A chambermaid in Pemberton's household confessed that she had seen her master burning documents late one night, documents that bore the seal of the royal treasury. A clerk who had worked for the Merchants Guild admitted that he had been paid to falsify records showing William Whitmore's signature on contracts he had never seen. A former guard from the prison where Eleanor's father had died revealed that visitors had come in the night before his death, visitors who had left with blood on their gloves. Each revelation was a dagger driven into the heart of the conspiracy that had destroyed Eleanor's family. But the most devastating discovery came not from servants or clerks, but from an unlikely source, Lady Pemberton herself. Eleanor had been summoned to the Pemberton estate to make adjustments to a gown for an upcoming celebration. It was a command she could not refuse without arousing suspicion, and so she went, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She worked in silence, her needle moving with practiced precision, while Lady Pemberton watched her with cold, appraising eyes. "You have changed," Lady Pemberton said suddenly. "Since the festival, there is something different about you." Eleanor kept her voice neutral. "I do not know what you mean, my lady." "Do you not?" Lady Pemberton's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth. "I have heard things, Mistress Whitmore. Whispers about you and the Duke of Ashworth. About his interest in your welfare. The Duke was kind enough to sponsor my attendance at the festival. Nothing more. Nothing more." Lady Pemberton laughed softly. "Do you take me for a fool? I have seen the way he looks at you, the way he speaks your name, as though it were something precious." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a murmur. "Be careful, girl. There are those who will not look kindly upon a seamstress who reaches above her station." "I am not reaching for anything," Eleanor said quietly. "I am simply trying to survive." Lady Pemberton studied her for a long moment, and something flickered in her eyes, something that might have been recognition, or perhaps regret. "Survival," she repeated. "Yes, I suppose we are all trying to survive, in our own ways." She fell silent after that, but Eleanor had seen the crack in her armor. Lady Pemberton was not the cold, ruthless woman she pretended to be. There was fear in her eyes, and guilt, and the weight of secrets she was tired of carrying. The next time Eleanor visited the estate, she found a letter hidden in the hem of the gown she had been altering. It was unsigned, but the handwriting was distinctly feminine. "The documents are in the study, behind a false panel in the wall. Third shelf from the left. He believes no one knows. But I know. And now you know." Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the words. Lady Pemberton was helping her, whether out of guilt, or fear of her husband, or some other motivation Eleanor could not fathom. The lady was offering her the key to Pemberton's destruction. That night, under cover of darkness, Eleanor slipped into the Pemberton estate through a servant's entrance she had used many times before. Her heart pounded as she made her way through the silent corridors, every shadow a potential enemy, every creak of the floorboards a possible alarm. But luck was with her. She found the study empty, the fire burned to embers, the household asleep. Her fingers searched the wall where the letter had indicated, pressing against wood panels until one shifted beneath her touch. Behind it, She found a leather satchel filled with papers. Even in the dim light, she could see enough to know that this was what she had been searching for. Forged documents, letters of instruction, ledgers showing payments to false witnesses, everything needed to prove Lord Pemberton's guilt and her father's innocence. Eleanor clutched the satchel to her chest and fled into the night. The evidence was presented to the king 3 weeks later, in a private audience arranged by the Duke of Ashworth. Eleanor was present, standing at Edward's side as he laid the documents before Henry's throne and spoke the words that would reshape the kingdom. "Your Majesty, I bring you proof of a conspiracy that has stained your reign with injustice. Lord Aldrich Pemberton did not uncover a traitor 7 years ago. He created one. William Whitmore was innocent, and the man who accused him of theft was himself the thief." Henry listened in silence as Edward explained each piece of evidence, his pale eyes moving between the documents and the faces of those who had brought them. Lord Pemberton had been summoned as well, and he stood across the chamber, his face a mask of outrage that grew increasingly desperate as the weight of evidence mounted against him. "Lies!" Pemberton shouted when the presentation was complete. "These documents are forgeries, created by that woman and her lover to destroy me. Your Majesty, surely you can see—" "What I see," Henry said slowly, his voice cold as winter ice, "is a man who has lied to his king, a man who used my trust to enrich himself and destroy an innocent family." He rose from his throne, and despite his slight frame, there was nothing frail about the fury that radiated from him. "Did you think I would not discover the truth, Pemberton? Did you think your secrets would remain buried forever? Your Majesty, please—" "Guards!" Henry's voice cut through Pemberton's pleas like a blade. "Take Lord Pemberton to the Tower. He will await trial for treason, fraud, and the murder of William Whitmore." The guards moved forward, and Pemberton's mask finally cracked. He lunged toward Eleanor, hatred burning in his eyes. You have done this. You have destroyed everything." But Edward stepped between them, his body a shield that Pemberton could not breach. "You destroyed yourself," Edward said quietly. "The moment you chose to build your fortune on the bones of innocent people, you sealed your own fate." Pemberton was dragged from the chamber, his screams echoing off the stone walls long after he had disappeared from sight. Eleanor stood in the silence that followed, trembling with the weight of what had just occurred. 7 years of suffering, of shame, of quiet desperation, and in a single hour it had all been vindicated. Her father was innocent. The world would know. She felt Edward's hand find hers, his fingers intertwining with her own. "It is over," he said softly. "You did it, Eleanor. You brought him justice." "We did it," she corrected, looking up at him with eyes that shimmered with unshed tears. "I could not have done any of this without you." Henry cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to the throne. The king's expression had softened, though wariness still lingered in his eyes. "Mistress Whitmore, I owe you an apology. I allowed myself to be deceived by a man I trusted, and you suffered for my blindness." "Your Majesty," Eleanor began. "I cannot undo what was done to your family," Henry continued. "But I can offer you something in return. Your father's name will be cleared, his honor restored. His trading licenses will be returned to you, along with the properties that were seized upon his arrest. You will have the means to rebuild everything that was taken from you." The words struck Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. She had expected vindication, perhaps even apology. But this was more than she had dared to dream. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she whispered. Henry nodded, then turned his gaze to Edward. "And you, cousin. It seems I owe you thanks as well. You risked much to bring this truth to light." "I did what was right," Edward said simply. "Nothing more." "Perhaps." Henry's lips curved into a smile that was almost genuine. "But doing what is right is rarer than you might imagine. I will remember this, Edward, and I will remember her." The spring came early that year, melting the snow that had blanketed the kingdom and bringing warmth to a land that had been cold for far too long. Eleanor stood in the garden of her new estate, The home her father had built for her mother decades ago returned to her at last, and watched the first flowers of the season push through the thawing earth. Narcissus blooms, golden and white, nodding gently in the breeze. She was no longer a seamstress. She was a woman of property, of means, of restored reputation. The trading company her father had built was thriving once more, guided by her steady hand and the lessons she had learned in years of hardship. But more than anything else, she was no longer alone. Edward appeared at her side, as he so often did these days. He had taken to visiting her estate whenever his duties at court allowed, claiming that the countryside air was good for his constitution. Eleanor suspected his reasons had little to do with air. "You are thinking again," he observed. "I am always thinking." "Yes," he smiled. "It is one of the things I love about you." Eleanor turned to look at him, her heart swelling with an emotion she no longer tried to suppress. "One of the things? There are many." Edward reached out and took her hand, pressing it gently to his lips. "Too many to count. A lifetime's worth, perhaps." "A lifetime." Eleanor felt the word settle into her chest like a promise. "That is a long time." "Not long enough." Edward's eyes held hers, and in their depths she saw the future unfolding, a future of partnership and purpose, of love earned through trial and strengthened by adversity. "Eleanor Whitmore, I know that our beginning was unconventional. I know that the world would say a duke and a seamstress do not belong together. But I have learned that the world is often wrong, and my heart is often right." He lowered himself to one knee, there in the garden where the narcissus bloomed and the spring wind carried the scent of new beginnings. "Will you marry me?" Eleanor looked down at the man who had saved her life, who had believed in her when no one else would, who had taught her that justice was worth fighting for and love was worth risking everything. "Yes," she said, and the word was both an answer and a vow. "Yes, Edward, I will marry you." He rose and pulled her into his arms, and she felt the last remnants of her old life fall away, like winter snow melting before the sun. She was not the disgraced daughter of a ruined merchant anymore. She was not the invisible seamstress who served those who despised her. She was Eleanor Blackwood, Duchess of Ashworth, and her story was only beginning. 1 year later, Eleanor stood in the great hall of the castle where she had once walked in fear, and watched as nobles bowed before her with respect that was no longer grudging. The winter festival had come again, but this time she was not a guest uncertain of her welcome. She was the hostess, standing at Edward's side, receiving the congratulations of lords and ladies who had learned that power could be found in the most unexpected places. Lady Pemberton was not present. After her husband's execution for treason, she had retired to a small estate in the north, her letters to Eleanor expressing gratitude for the mercy that had been shown to her despite her role in the conspiracy. Eleanor had never responded, but she had made certain that the lady was provided for. Vengeance was hollow, grace was eternal. The king himself attended the celebration, his paranoia somewhat tempered by the loyalty Edward had proven. He greeted Eleanor with a bow that scandalized the older nobles and delighted the younger ones, and he spoke to her as an equal rather than a subject. "You have done something remarkable, Duchess," Henry said, his eyes holding hers with something that might have been admiration. "You have shown that courage can triumph over corruption and that truth cannot be buried forever." "I had help, Your Majesty." Eleanor glanced at Edward, who stood nearby, watching her with the quiet pride that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. "Indeed you did," Henry smiled. "You chose well, cousin. Very well indeed." Later that night, when the music had faded and the guests had retired, Eleanor and Edward walked together through the snow-covered gardens of their estate. The moon was full and bright, casting silver light across a world that seemed for once at peace. "Are you happy?" Edward asked, his arm wrapped around her waist. Eleanor considered the question. She thought of her father, who had died in darkness, but whose name now shone with restored honor. She thought of her mother, whose grave she visited each month with flowers and whispered words of love. She thought of the girl she had been, frightened, alone, convinced that beauty was for others and suffering was her birthright. That girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who had walked through fire and emerged not as ash, but as light. "Yes," she said, leaning into Edward's warmth. "I am happy." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Then so am I." They stood together in the moonlight, watching the snow fall soft and silent around them, and Eleanor knew, with the certainty of someone who has earned every joy through pain, that this was not an ending. It was a beginning, and it was everything she had ever dreamed it could be. If you watched until here, it is because this story touched your heart. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end, so I can get to know you and know who truly appreciates the stories on this channel." If you have not yet subscribed, now is the moment. Click the subscribe button and join our community of souls who believe that beauty, courage, and love can still triumph in a world that often seems too dark. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, please leave a like and share it with someone who needs to hear that redemption is always possible. Until the next tale, may your heart remain brave and your spirit remain true.